Imagine standing in a small, quiet cottage in the Romanian countryside. Suddenly, the air around you changes. A stone, the size of a man's fist, materializes out of thin air and smashes into the wall, inches from your head. Then others. They aren't being thrown from outside. They are coming from within the room. And they are all aimed at one person, a terrified 10-year-old girl cowering in the corner. In 1923, the village of Talpa didn't see a child in need of help. They saw a breach in reality. They saw the manifestation of an ancient evil they called devil. But what the world's leading scientists would later discover was far more terrifying than any demon. It was the power of a human mind, exploding. This is the documented, bone-chilling true story of Eleonora Zugun, the girl who rained stones. Welcome to Well of Monsters. To understand how a child became the most studied paranormal case in history, we have to go back to where it all started. Eleonora Zugun was born in 1913 in Talpa, a tiny speck on the map of northern Romania. Life there was primitive, muddy roads, grueling farm work, and a culture built on deep, heavy superstition. Eleonora was a quiet, unremarkable kid. Just another face in the village. Until that one afternoon in 1923, she was walking to her grandmother's house when she felt a strange, sudden urge. She picked up a few stones and threw them against a fence. A normal thing for a kid to do, right? But then, the world threw them back. Suddenly, it wasn't a game anymore. Rocks started flying at her. They would smash against the walls of her house, following her from room to room. When her family tried to hide her, the stones materialized inside the house, falling from the ceiling like rain. The villagers didn't see a scared 10-year-old, they saw a monster. And that was the moment Eleonora's life as a human being ended, and her nightmare as a prisoner of the unknown began. The village of Talpa didn't take long to turn on her. In a place built on ancient fears, a girl who rained stones wasn't a victim, she was a plague. The local priest tried everything. He drenched Eleonora in holy water while she lay on the dirt floor of the church, shivering and sobbing in pure terror. But the thing wouldn't leave. During one frantic prayer, a heavy crucifix reportedly lifted off the altar and flew across the room, nearly taking the priest's head off. That was the breaking point. The village elders reached a verdict: for the town to survive, the girl had to go. Think about the sheer cruelty of that moment. Her own parents, the people who were supposed to be her shield, were convinced to throw her away. At just 12 years old, Eleonora was loaded into a cart and driven to a local mental asylum. She was locked in a cage with people who had truly lost their minds. But the walls weren't thick enough to stop the horror. The doctors there were men of science, but they soon began looking over their shoulders. Even when Eleonora was strapped into a straitjacket, unable to move a finger, she would suddenly howl in pain. When the nurses stripped back her sleeves, they found fresh, deep bite marks appearing on her skin in real time. Jagged teeth marks from a jaw that didn't exist, bleeding through her clothes. She was a prisoner, yes, but she wasn't alone in that cell. The devil was trapped in there with her. But news of the Poltergeist girl was spreading far beyond the borders of Romania. It reached a massive, luxury apartment in the heart of Vienna, belonging to Countess Zoe Vasilko-Seretsky. The Countess was a wealthy aristocrat obsessed with the occult. She didn't just want to help Eleonora, she wanted to solve her. She fought the doctors, hacked through the legal red tape, and eventually won custody of the girl. Imagine the shock for Eleonora. One day, she's staring at iron bars in a Romanian madhouse. The next, she's stepping onto polished marble floors, surrounded by silk curtains and servants. But she soon realized she hadn't been saved. She had just been moved to a different kind of laboratory. The Countess became a scientific mother, but she was obsessed. She watched Eleonora 24/7, recording every move in a diary. Scientists from all over Europe, including the famous British investigator Harry Price, came to stare at her like she was a circus freak. Eleonora was caught in a new nightmare, a world where she was no longer a person, but a data point. A world where her trauma was being harvested for the sake of science. Eleonora didn't just spend a few weeks under observation, she spent 2 agonizing years as a human laboratory. From 1925 to 1927, her life wasn't measured in years, but in incidents and data entries. The Countess's apartment in Vienna became a stage for the elite. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl, already terrified of the devil that bites you, only to be surrounded by men in stiff suits who look at you like a broken machine. They didn't offer a hand to hold, they offered a magnifying glass. To prove she wasn't faking it, the scientists reached levels of cruelty that bordered on torture. They would coat her hands in thick, black ink so she couldn't touch her own skin without leaving a mark. They forced her to wear heavy leather mittens, even in the sweltering heat of summer, and tied her arms to the sides of her chair for hours on end. They even dusted every inch of the furniture with fine white flour, waiting, hoping, to catch a footprint or a finger mark that would prove she was a fraud. But the devil loved the attention. The more they restrained her, the more violent the manifestations became. While she sat there, immobile and weeping, red welts would rise on her back, blooming through her white dress like ink on a blotter. Deep, jagged teeth marks would swell up on her neck in seconds, appearing under the direct gaze of 5 different doctors. They would lean in closer, measuring the distance between the teeth, timing how long it took for the blood to reach the surface, while Eleonora's screams filled the room. She wasn't a child to them. She was a phenomenon. They would discuss her in the third person right in front of her, debating if she was a medium or a hysteric, while she sat there, bleeding and exhausted. By the time the Countess took her to London in 1926 to be tested by Harry Price, Eleonora was a shell of a person. She was an international headline, a freak show for the intellectual elite. In London, they pushed her even further. They put her in a controlled testing chamber, stripped of all personal belongings. They used primitive motion sensors and high-speed cameras, trying to trap the energy. Price recorded over 1,000 separate incidents during her stay. Stones materialized in closed rooms, metal objects twisted in her hands like they were made of silk. But the real cost was her mind. Eleonora began to suffer from severe depression and anxiety attacks. She associated the smell of old books and the sound of scratching pens with pain. She was a 14-year-old girl whose puberty was being analyzed under a microscope, her every emotional outburst documented as a psychic trigger. Her trauma wasn't being healed, it was being farmed. The scientists were getting their Nobel-level data, the Countess was getting her fame, and the devil was getting its blood. The only one losing everything was Eleonora. By the end of 1927, Eleonora's body had simply had enough. The devil, or whatever was living inside her, wasn't just hurting her anymore, it was consuming her. During the final sessions in London, the phenomena reached a terrifying peak. Stones didn't just fly, they shattered against the walls with the force of bullets. The bite marks weren't just red welts, they were deep, bleeding gashes that left permanent scars. Eleonora was no longer crying, she was hollow. She had become a ghost in her own life, a spectator to her own torture. And then, something happened that the scientists couldn't explain with their meters and notebooks. As Eleonora turned 15, as her body finally crossed the threshold into womanhood, the monster began to starve. The stones stopped mid-air. The scratches stopped appearing. The invisible teeth finally let go of her throat. To Harry Price and the Countess, this was a biological shift, a sign that the psychic energy was tied to her puberty. But to Eleonora, it was like a fever had finally broken. The show was over because the fuel, her childhood innocence and her raw, unprocessed fear, was gone. When the show was finally over, the scientists packed up their cameras, published their books, and just moved on. The circus didn't end with a standing ovation. It ended with a train ticket. Once the stones stopped flying and the bite marks faded, the scientists simply lost interest. They had their photos, they had their proof, and they had their careers. To them, Eleonora was a battery that had finally run dry. The Countess, the woman who had acted like her mother and savior, found a new mystery to chase. And just like that, Eleonora was put on a train back to Romania. She was a teenager now, caught in a terrifying limbo. How do you go back after that? The village of Talpa still whispered her name like a curse, they didn't want the devil's servant back in their fields. And the elite in Vienna, they had already moved on to the next headline. She was too damaged for the high society and too strange for the mud of her home. So, she did the only thing a survivor could do. She chose to disappear. She moved to the city of Botoşan. No one there knew about the London laboratories or the rain of stones. She didn't call the newspapers, and she never asked for a cent of the fame she once had. She found a small room, bought a needle and thread, and became a dressmaker. Think about those hands. The hands that men in suits used to tie with wire and coat in black ink just to make sure she wasn't cheating. Now, those same hands had to thread a needle in the dim light of a Romanian apartment. Every day, for 10 or 12 hours at a time, she just sewed. It was hard, repetitive work. She sewed buttons, fixed hems, and made dresses for neighbors who had no idea she was once the most famous girl in Europe. She used the routine to drown out the memories. Every stitch was a way to keep the devil away, not with holy water, but with concentration. If she focused on the needle, she didn't have to think about the stones flying through the air or the men staring at her through magnifying glasses. She got married, changed her name, and built a wall of fabric between herself and the world. She lived through the horrors of World War II and the suffocating years of communism. In a country where being different could get you killed, Eleonora became a master of being invisible. She died in 1996, at 83 years old. By then, she wasn't a legend or a headline anymore. She was just an elderly woman in a quiet apartment, someone who had lived through a century of chaos and finally reached the end of her breath. She died in a world that had completely forgotten her, and for Eleonora, that was the ultimate victory. She had spent 60 years making sure she was invisible. She buried the girl who rained stones so deep that even her neighbors didn't know who she really was. She carried the scars on her arms to her grave, hidden under the long sleeves she wore until her last day. In the end, Eleonora Zugun wasn't a monster, and she wasn't a miracle. She was just a survivor who outlived the monsters, the ones in the shadows, and the ones who treated her like a lab rat. She finally got the one thing she had wanted since she was 10 years old, to be absolutely, perfectly ordinary. Thanks for joining us at the Well of Monsters. If you want to hear more stories about the people the world tried to break, hit that subscribe button. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. See you at the bottom of the well.